What if your blood carried a truth so ancient, so terrifying that it threatened to rewrite the history of the world? What if you were never just a slave but a sovereign? What if the proof has been pulsing through black veins for over 338,000 years? This is not speculation. This is not myth. This is science shaken to its very core by the blood of one man. His name was Albert Perry, a quiet, ordinary black man from South Carolina. He never sought fame, never sought power. Yet his DNA held a secret that made both science and the church tremble. Because in his blood, researchers uncovered something they were never prepared to face: a lineage older than Homo sapiens itself. A Y chromosome so ancient it shattered everything they thought they knew about human origins. A discovery so dangerous, they buried it. They silenced it. They hoped you would never hear it. But tonight, we will uncover what they tried to erase. We will follow the trail of blood and scripture from the book of Genesis to the slave ships, from the temples of Africa to the hidden mounds of America. We will expose why Perry's DNA is not just science, it is prophecy, and why his blood tells a story of kings, of priests, of the first people made in the image of God. This is not a sermon. This is an awakening. This is echoes of the Nazarene, where hidden scripture, blood, and history collide. And it all begins with a black man from South Carolina, Albert Perry. Chapter 1. The Ordinary Man with an Extraordinary Bloodline. Albert Perry was no scholar, no prophet, no public figure. He was not the type of man history books usually preserve. He lived in South Carolina in quiet obscurity, as millions of black men in America have lived, bearing the weight of a history that never seemed to honor them. To his neighbors, he was simply another working man, another descendant of those forced into a land not of their choosing. Nothing in his life suggested he carried a secret that would shake the foundations of science, history, and theology all at once. And yet within his veins flowed something extraordinary. When Perry passed away, his DNA was studied as part of routine genealogical and medical research. Scientists expected nothing unusual. At best, they thought they might trace his ancestry back to Africa, perhaps linking his line to certain regions or tribes the way genetic tests often do. But what they discovered defied every expectation. Inside Perry's Y chromosome, the marker passed down from father to son. There was a mystery. His genetic code did not match any known human lineage. The computer databases came back confused, signaling that this DNA did not belong anywhere in the human family tree they had constructed. At first, researchers thought it was a mistake, perhaps a contamination, a misread. But no, the results held firm. Albert Perry's Y chromosome was something never before seen. And then came the shock. When his DNA was dated, its lineage was revealed to be astonishingly old, over 338,000 years. That is not just older than any African king or any biblical patriarch. That is older than modern Homo sapiens themselves. For comparison, the so-called Y chromosomal atom the genetic ancestor science had previously identified as the root of all living men was believed to have lived around 200,000 years ago. Perry's bloodline predated that by well over 100,000 years. Do you understand what that means? It means that within a man who lived and died in South Carolina, a man who walked the same streets as you and me was carried a genetic memory stretching further back than the dawn of our species. It was as if Perry's blood whispered, "Your timeline is wrong. Your history is incomplete. The origin is deeper, and it flows through black veins." The first twist of the story is not merely scientific but prophetic. Because if Perry's DNA is real, and it is, then the foundations of how we think about humanity are shaken. Science had built its narrative around a tree of evolution, placing Homo sapiens at the crown, with roots stretching back no further than 200,000 years. But Perry's chromosome was like finding a hidden root far below the tree, reaching deeper into the soil of time, older, darker, and more enduring than anyone dared to admit. Why does this matter? Because for centuries, the black body was treated as inferior. Entire systems, slavery, colonialism, segregation, were built on the lie that black people were less than human, or at best, latecomers to civilization. Yet here was a discovery proving the opposite, that black blood may very well be the oldest blood on Earth, the primal reservoir from which humanity itself flowed. Albert Perry never knew this about himself. He never stood in a pulpit proclaiming ancient truths. He never published a paper to announce his legacy. He died like many men before him, uncelebrated. But in death, his blood spoke louder than his life ever could. And that blood spoke a dangerous truth. The first human story might not have begun in caves of Europe or in sterile evolutionary charts, but in the flesh and veins of black men and women whose history predates every empire, every theology, every racial construct. The discovery startled the scientific community. But instead of headlines, instead of documentaries, instead of celebrations of a black man holding the oldest bloodline known to science, there was silence. Whispers in academic journals, technical debates hidden from the public eye, almost as if the world was not ready to face what Perry's blood declared. And why would they not be ready? Because if this knowledge became mainstream, it would dismantle centuries of whitewashed history. It would shake the arrogance of racial superiority. It would demand that we rewrite what it means to be human and who gets to claim the title of first. For the church, it would echo an older scripture, "The life of the flesh is in the blood," Leviticus 17:11. Perry's blood was not just a biological curiosity, it was a testimony. A living scroll written not in ink but in chromosomes, declaring that black life is not marginal but central, not a footnote but a foundation. Think about the paradox: an ordinary man unnoticed by the world carried within him a genetic code older than Homo sapiens. His bloodline stretched back to a time beyond history, beyond written scripture, beyond pyramids and prophets, beyond even Adam, as science imagined him. Perry's blood was like a trumpet blast from the past, cutting through centuries of lies and saying, "You were not born in chains. You were here before the chains. You were here at the beginning." And if one man's DNA could hold such a secret, what might the blood of millions reveal? What if every black man and woman carries within them a lineage that science fears to acknowledge, a record that history tried to erase, a prophecy encoded in their very cells? Albert Perry was a man the world almost forgot. But in forgetting him, they nearly overlooked the key to humanity's origin. His life may have been ordinary, but his blood was extraordinary. And the question now is this: what else lies hidden in the bloodlines of those written out of history? Because Perry's DNA is not the end of the story, it is only the beginning. Chapter 2: The Shock to Modern Science. Science has long clung to a story about human origins. According to geneticists, every man alive today can trace his paternal lineage back to a single ancestor, a figure known in scientific circles as Y-chromosomal Adam. This Adam was not the biblical figure walking in Eden, but a scientific construct identified through the Y chromosome, which passes from father to son, generation after generation. For decades, researchers believed this genetic Adam lived about 200,000 years ago in Africa. He was thought to represent the root of all living men, the marker of humanity's beginning in the scientific narrative. This was the neat picture textbooks painted, the comforting timeline. Scientists clung to 200,000 years Africa as the cradle, and from there humanity spread outward. But Albert Perry shattered that timeline. When Perry's DNA was analyzed, his Y chromosome refused to fit into the tree. It did not descend from the same branch that every other man on Earth seemed to share. Instead, his lineage branched off much earlier, so early in fact that it rewrote the limits of human history. Perry's Y chromosome was dated to be over 338,000 years old, more than 100,000 years older than the so-called Y chromosomal Adam. In one stroke, a quiet man from South Carolina disrupted the bedrock of modern science. If Perry's lineage is real, and it is then Y chromosomal, Adam was not the beginning, but a chapter deep into the story. Perry's blood carried a root far older, a line that stretched back into an age when science claims modern humans did not even exist. This discovery shook geneticists to their core. Imagine dedicating your life to constructing a family tree of humanity, mapping lineages and tracing them back with precision, only to discover that your root was not the root at all. Perry's DNA was like finding a door hidden at the base of the family tree, a secret tunnel leading deeper underground to a foundation far more ancient than anyone imagined. The implications were staggering. If one black man in South Carolina carried a lineage older than Homo sapiens, then what did that say about the story of human origins? What did it say about the neat evolutionary diagrams hung on classroom walls? What did it say about the authority of Western science to define where humanity came from? If Perry is real, then the root of humanity is not Europe, not Asia, but black blood. This was not just a scientific detail, it was a revelation that threatened to overturn cultural, political, and theological assumptions. For centuries, racial ideologies had painted black people as inferior, primitive, or latecomers to civilization. Now, science itself revealed that the black man's blood may in fact be the oldest, the root of humanity itself. What irony that the very discipline once used to justify hierarchy and oppression now uncovered a truth that reversed it. And yet, instead of celebrating this discovery, the reaction was strangely muted. There were no grand announcements, no headlines blazing across the world. Instead, Perry's DNA was quietly documented in technical papers buried in the dense language of academia. Why? Because this revelation was dangerous. To admit that a black man's lineage was older than Homo sapiens would demand a rewriting of history, and not just scientific history, but cultural history, racial history, and even theologies built on distorted hierarchies. The challenge was not merely academic, it raised unsettling questions. If Perry's lineage predates Homo sapiens, then what was he? A remnant of an older species, a bridge between ancient populations long thought extinct, or was he proof that humanity's story is far messier, far deeper than the simplified models allow? Scientists struggled with these questions, offering tentative explanations. Some suggested that Perry's lineage represented interbreeding between Homo sapiens and an older, archaic human species. Others wondered if isolated populations had survived far longer than previously believed. But every explanation carried one undeniable truth. Perry's blood was older than the story science had told us. Science prides itself on progress, on the pursuit of truth. Yet when truth emerges that destabilizes established narratives, the instinct is often to suppress, to contain, to silence. Perry's DNA was treated like a dangerous secret whispered in laboratories but not shouted in lecture halls. This is where the story leaves the realm of pure genetics and enters prophecy. Because the Bible had already spoken, the life of the flesh is in the blood. Perry's blood carried a testimony. Science could not explain a testimony older than textbooks, older than diagrams, older than evolutionary charts. His Y chromosome was like a hidden scripture revealing that black blood was not marginal, not peripheral, but foundational to the human story. A black man in America, born into a society that often devalues his life, carried within him the oldest lineage ever found. The very world that treated him as less than was forced by his DNA to admit he was more than the bearer of a bloodline that predates the species itself. The scientists could not deny it, they could only bury it. But truth once unearthed does not die easily. Perry's DNA became a crack in the wall of certainty, a reminder that history is not fixed but fragile, and that sometimes the smallest voice, the blood of one forgotten man, can shake the great institutions of knowledge. If Albert Perry carried such an ancient lineage, what does that mean for the millions of others? How many more carry hidden roots buried deeper than science dares to admit? What would it mean if the origin of humanity was not a tidy point in time, but a vast ocean of bloodlines with black blood as its oldest current? Perry's discovery left science unsettled, but for those with eyes to see it carried a different message, one not of despair, but of revelation. That the story of humanity is larger than we have been told, that the black man's place in history is not at the margins, but at the center, not as the last, but as the first. And if this is true, then the silence of science is not the end of the story. It is only the beginning of a much larger unveiling. Chapter 3. The Conspiracy of Silence. When Albert Perry's DNA was first examined, the scientists knew they had stumbled upon something extraordinary. They knew this was not just another data point, not just another genetic variation to be filed away. This was history itself, encoded in blood, reaching back beyond the accepted limits of human existence. And yet, instead of making headlines, instead of sparking documentaries and public debates, Perry's discovery was buried, hidden away in the technical language of academic journals. You and I both know how the media works. When a skeleton is found in Europe, it becomes global news. When a Viking ship is uncovered, headlines shout across continents. When DNA links Europeans to ancient kings, the world celebrates heritage. But when a black man from South Carolina is found to carry the oldest bloodline on Earth, older than Homo sapiens itself, the world grows quiet. Why? Why did they bury the story of Perry but celebrate every discovery that flatters Europe? It is a haunting question, one that refuses to go away. And the answer is as unsettling as the discovery itself. Because if Perry's lineage had been trumpeted from the rooftops, it would have forced the world to confront a dangerous truth that the foundations of history, of race, of supremacy are built on lies. If the discovery had been made public, it would have shattered the illusion of European centrality, dismantled the scaffolding of white supremacy, and exposed the fragility of the racial hierarchies that dominate modern thought. Think about the timing. Perry's DNA was studied in the early 2000s, a period when discussions of race and history were already fraught. The civil rights movement had left its mark, but inequality persisted. Entire academic fields were still dominated by Western narratives, still telling the story of civilization as if it began in Greece and Rome, as if Africa only entered history as a slave market. To suddenly announce that a black man carried DNA older than Homo sapiens, it would have been like dropping a torch into a room full of dry paper. The fire would have consumed everything. And so instead of fire, they chose silence. The scientific papers were written in dense, cautious language. Terms like unusual divergence and unexpected lineage replaced the plain truth that Perry's blood rewrote human history. The story was confined to niche journals hidden from the public eye. The media, always eager for headlines about ancient Europe or new human fossils, looked the other way. The silence was not accidental, it was deliberate. Because knowledge is power. And if knowledge threatens to destabilize power, it is often hidden. For centuries, the West has curated history like a museum exhibit, polished, selective, arranged to exalt certain civilizations while erasing others. Perry's DNA did not fit that exhibit. It told a story not of Greece or Rome, not of Anglo-Saxon kings or European monarchs, but of black men and women carrying within their bodies the oldest living testimony of humanity. This silence reveals something critical. Science, though claiming objectivity, is not immune to politics. Data does not float above society. It is interpreted, framed, and often suppressed by those with something to lose. Perry's blood threatened the very foundation of racial hierarchy. To acknowledge it would have meant admitting that the people once enslaved were not merely participants in history, they were its beginning. But perhaps the most shocking part is this: by burying Perry's story, the gatekeepers of science repeated the very pattern history has followed for centuries. Black voices silenced, black discoveries erased, black legacies ignored. It was not the first time, and it will not be the last unless the silence is broken. And yet silence itself is a form of confession. When they refused to speak, they admitted fear. Fear that if the world knew the truth, statues would fall, textbooks would be rewritten, and the myth of European superiority would crumble. Fear that young black men and women long told they were descendants of slaves would realize instead that they are descendants of kings, prophets, and the very first people on earth. Perry's DNA is not just a scientific anomaly, it is a mirror held up to society. It reflects how truth is handled when it threatens power. It shows that discovery alone does not guarantee revelation. Revelation must be permitted, allowed, curated. and when revelation undermines empire, it is locked away. But blood cannot be silenced. Scripture declares the life of the flesh is in the blood, and Perry's blood still cries out. Like the blood of Abel, it testifies against the systems that try to bury it. Silence only makes the testimony louder. Imagine what might have happened if the discovery had been publicized. Imagine a headline across the New York Times, "Black man's DNA found to be the oldest in human history." Imagine documentaries exploring Africa and America not as places of slavery and colonization, but as the root of human existence. Imagine classrooms where children of African descent were told, "Your blood is the oldest, your lineage the deepest." Such a revelation would have transformed identity, culture, and politics. It would have challenged every hierarchy built on the myth of white superiority, and so they buried it. But burying truth does not erase it. Seeds buried in the ground only grow stronger. Perry's DNA, hidden in academic papers, has begun to resurface. Scholars, activists, and ordinary people are rediscovering it. And once rediscovered, it cannot be forgotten. The silence of science is not the end of this story. It is the turning point. Because silence breeds questions, and questions breed hunger. And hunger for truth is far more dangerous than truth itself. If they buried Perry's story, what else have they buried? What other discoveries lie hidden, suppressed, waiting to be uncovered? And what will happen when all of them come to light? Because make no mistake, the silence will not last forever. And as we move forward, we will see how Perry's blood, far from being an isolated anomaly, connects to something even deeper, the witness of Scripture itself, and the mysterious testimony of blood in the Bible. Chapter 4. Blood and the Bible. The life of the flesh is in the blood. These words from Leviticus 17:11 echo like thunder across millennia. For the ancient Israelites, blood was not simply a fluid, it was sacred essence. It was the invisible current that carried life itself. To spill blood unjustly was to cry out against heaven. To preserve blood was to preserve the covenant between God and his people. And now, centuries later, a quiet man's blood in South Carolina confirmed what the scriptures had always declared. Life is not just sustained in the blood, it is remembered there. Albert Perry's DNA was not merely genetic code. It was like a living scroll written in the alphabet of chromosomes, bearing witness to truths too ancient for paper or stone. When scientists unlocked his Y chromosome, they stumbled not only into biology, but into theology. His blood declared what Scripture had already whispered, that within blood lies testimony. Not just the continuation of life, but the preservation of memory. Blood does not only carry oxygen, nutrients, or energy, it carries memory. Encoded within it are the stories of generations stretching back into time itself. Blood remembers battles fought, lands walked, diseases endured, environments survived. It remembers the faces of fathers and the struggles of mothers. And Perry's blood remembered something older than Homo sapiens, a history written before recorded history, an ancestry stretching to the beginning. This truth overturns centuries of distortion. For too long, the world told black people their history began with chains, that their story started in the hull of slave ships and plantations in servitude. But Perry's blood testifies otherwise. It says, you were not born in slavery, you were born in sovereignty, you were not created in bondage, you were there at the root, the genesis, the first image bearers of God. Perry's DNA becomes more than science. It is a prophetic witness, a biological scripture hidden in plain sight. Think of how the Bible treats blood. When Abel was murdered, Scripture tells us his blood cried out from the ground, Genesis 4:10. Blood speaks, it testifies, it demands justice. And Perry's blood, unearthed in a laboratory, cries out still. It says, the story you were told is incomplete. The origin lies deeper in black veins in ancient rivers of life. This is why the silence around Perry's discovery is so haunting. Because it is not only a denial of science, it is a suppression of prophecy. It is like trying to silence Abel's cry covering the ground, so his voice cannot be heard. But blood cannot be silenced. Blood speaks, whether men listen or not. Theologians have long said that Christ's blood speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. Hebrews 12:24. His sacrifice sealed redemption. But even here, the parallel deepens blood, as testimony blood, as covenant blood, as memory of what has been, and hope of what will come. Perry's DNA fits into this prophetic frame. It is not salvific like Christ's blood, but it is revelatory. It reveals identity, heritage, and origin. It tells a story science tried to suppress and religion often ignored. The Bible never treats blood as generic. It is always particular. The blood of Israel marked doors at Passover. The blood of sacrifices marked covenants. The bloodline of David determined kingship. Identity was always tied to blood. In the same way, Perry's blood carries identity, not only his own, but the identity of millions. A lineage older than Adam as science defines him, a root deeper than civilization, a current flowing through black men and women across the world. Blood is more than life, it is memory. And memory is dangerous when it challenges power, because memory restores dignity. Memory reminds a people who they were before they were enslaved. Memory pulls back the veil and declares, you are not the debris of history, you are its origin. What happens when a people begin to remember, when they begin to see their blood not as cursed but as chosen? That is why Perry's story matters. His blood is a mirror forcing black people to see themselves not through the eyes of oppression, but through the testimony of DNA. It is a scientific witness to what Scripture has always hinted: the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Science may call it genetics, theology may call it testimony, but the effect is the same. Perry's DNA is like a buried scroll unearthed in the modern age, declaring a truth too dangerous for empire to celebrate. It says that black blood is not peripheral, not marginal, not accidental, it is foundational. The life of humanity is in the blood, and that blood flows from black veins, stretching back beyond Homo sapiens. Think of the power of this revelation. Imagine a young man in America told all his life that his history began in slavery. Now he learns that within his veins pulses a lineage older than recorded history, that his blood remembers what science forgot, that the Bible confirms what biology now reveals. How would his shoulders straighten? How would his dignity rise? This is why Perry's blood is so much more than a scientific curiosity. It is a prophetic disruption. It demands that we reconsider how we tell the story of humanity, how we frame history, how we read Scripture itself. Because if the life of the flesh is in the blood, then so too is the memory of the flesh, the story of the flesh, the origin of the flesh. And that memory encoded in Perry's DNA testifies that black people are not the footnote of history. They are the first chapter. They are not the afterthought of civilization. They are its beginning. So as the Bible proclaims that blood gives life, Perry's DNA proclaims that blood gives truth. And truth, once revealed, cannot be buried forever. And if Perry's blood is a testimony, then we must ask what other testimonies lie hidden in the bones, in the blood, in the soil. What other scrolls of DNA remain unopened, waiting to tell the world what it does not want to hear? Because Perry's blood is not the end of this revelation. It is only the beginning of a much larger story, one that archaeology itself will soon confirm. Chapter 5. The Forgotten Archaeological Evidence. If Albert Perry's blood was a scroll of memory written in chromosomes, then the earth itself is a library of testimony written in stone, clay, and soil. For too long, we have been told that the story of black people in the Americas began with ships, chains, and plantations. But what if the land itself testifies otherwise? What if, before the first Europeans set foot on this continent, before the transatlantic slave trade, before the rewriting of history, black faces were already carved into its monuments, black hands had already built its sacred structures, and black tribes already ruled its soil? Let us begin in Mexico with the mysterious Olmec civilization. Archaeologists have unearthed massive stone heads, some towering 10 feet tall, carved with uncanny precision. These colossal heads dating back at least 3,000 years bear features unmistakably African broad noses, full lips, and faces that mirror the very people later brought to these shores in chains. For decades, scholars debated their meaning. Some dismissed the resemblance as coincidence. Others dared to suggest what the evidence declared openly. These were not stylized abstractions, but realistic depictions of African presence in the Americas long before Columbus. The stone itself whispers black presence was here before the chains. But the testimony does not stop in Mexico. Cross into the southern United States, and the land rises in great mounds, earthen pyramids, temples, and ceremonial complexes stretching from Louisiana to Ohio. The most famous Cahokia once held a population larger than London in its day. Its structures align with celestial patterns, its geometry reflecting sacred knowledge not unlike the Nile Valley pyramids of Africa. How did such knowledge find its way into America? Who carried the architectural wisdom, the astronomical precision, the sacred geometry that mirrored the practices of Egypt and Nubia? For generations, archaeologists tried to sever these mounds from Africa, inventing narratives of lost tribes or independent invention. Yet when you look closely, the echoes are undeniable. The Nile and the Mississippi speak a similar language of earth and sky, temple and star. Could it be that black people carrying ancient memory imprinted the same patterns here that they once built across the ocean? And then there are the tribes, the Yamasee, the Wheater, and others whose oral traditions speak of being black people of this land. Early European accounts describe them as dark-skinned with features indistinguishable from Africans. They were not foreigners. They were not imported. They were indigenous black nations dwelling on this soil long before the Atlantic trade. Some were later enslaved alongside Africans brought from across the ocean. Their identities merged, their histories blurred until all were labeled slaves and their ancient sovereignty was erased. Why have you not heard these stories? Because history, like science, curates what serves empire. The existence of indigenous black tribes in America complicates the narrative that all black people came as slaves. It means that the blood of sovereignty, not merely the blood of servitude, flowed through these lands. It means that when the colonizers arrived, they were not encountering an empty continent, they were encountering kings and priests, builders and astronomers, whose presence testified to something the world was not ready to acknowledge. Imagine the weight of this. If Perry's DNA stretched human history backward beyond Homo sapiens, then archaeology stretches black history across oceans, across continents, across time itself. It connects the bloodline to monuments, the chromosome to the stone, the genetic memory to the earth's testimony. It says the same truth in different languages. Black presence is older, deeper, and more foundational than the stories told in school books. Think of the implications. If Olmec heads are African, if American mounds echo the Nile, if tribes like the Yamasee and Wheater ruled long before colonization, then the entire narrative of discovery collapses. Columbus did not discover. He invaded. Europeans did not bring civilization. They encountered it and then erased it. This erasure was not accidental, it was systematic. To justify slavery, colonization, and genocide, they had to rewrite history. They had to turn kings into slaves, temples into curiosities, tribes into myths. They had to silence the testimony of the stones just as they silenced the testimony of Perry's blood. Because if both blood and land declared that black people were here first, the entire edifice of white supremacy would crumble. The land itself testifies black presence was here before the chains. This is not romantic speculation. It is documented reality. Spanish chroniclers wrote of encountering black-skinned natives in the Americas before large-scale African slavery began. Oral histories among native tribes recall alliances and conflicts with black nations. The physical evidence sculptures, mounds, artifacts refuses to be explained away. The earth remembers even when men forget. And here lies the deeper truth. Just as DNA carries memory, so does land. Stones remember the hands that carved them. Soil remembers the feet that walked upon it. Rivers remember the rituals performed at their banks. And all of it cries out like Abel's blood from the ground, "You were here. You mattered. You are not erased." But why does this matter now? Because history is identity. If you convince a people that their history begins in chains, they will live as if they are bound. But if you reveal that their history begins in sovereignty, they will rise as kings and priests once more. Perry's DNA was one testimony. Archaeology is another. Together they form a chorus that cannot be silenced. If the land testifies so clearly, why is the world still silent? Why are the Olmec heads dismissed as coincidence? Why are the mounds explained away as primitive rather than profound? Why are black tribes erased from the record? Because empire knows that identity is power, and to control the future, one must first erase the past. But the past has a way of breaking through. Just as Perry's DNA surfaced against all odds, so too do the stones rise unmovable, undeniable, declaring what textbooks deny. The land speaks, and its voice cannot be silenced forever. If both blood and land testify, what happens when Scripture itself joins the witness? What happens when archaeology, genetics, and the Bible all align to declare that black people are not marginal, but foundational to humanity's story? That is where this journey leads. Because after Perry's blood and the Earth's monuments, the next witness to take the stand is none other than the Bible itself, a book that when read with open eyes reveals a story far different from what empire taught. Chapter 6. Black People in the Bible and Israel. For centuries, the Bible has been read through the lens of empire filtered, translated and interpreted in ways that placed Europe at the center of God's story. But when you strip away the distortions, when you listen carefully to the text itself, another picture emerges, one that does not exclude black people but includes them at the very heart of the biblical narrative. Consider the chilling words of Deuteronomy 28. In this chapter, Moses speaks prophetically of what would happen if Israel broke covenant with God. He warns of curses that would fall upon them, and among those curses is a haunting image, "And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships. And there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you." For centuries, readers puzzled over this verse. Why would Israel need ships to return to Egypt? Egypt was accessible by land. There was no need for ships. Unless, of course, Moses was not speaking of Egypt the nation, but of Egypt as bondage itself. Suddenly the words sharpen, a people carried away in ships sold to enemies enslaved in foreign lands. Does this not echo the transatlantic slave trade? Does this not mirror the nightmare of millions of Africans torn from their homeland, shipped across the ocean, and sold as slaves in the Americas? This prophecy in Deuteronomy becomes more than ancient words. It becomes a mirror. It reflects not only Israel's ancient struggles, but also the cries of black men and women shackled in the holds of slave ships. It is no wonder that many enslaved Africans in America recognized themselves in the children of Israel. They read the Bible and heard their own story. They sang spirituals about crossing the Jordan, about Moses leading them out, about God delivering his people from Pharaoh's hand. They saw no separation between Israel's bondage and their own. Black people are not outsiders borrowing Israel's story. They are not spectators watching someone else's prophecy unfold. For many communities across Africa and the diaspora, the conviction is clear: they are Israel. Their blood carries the ancient covenant. Their suffering reflects the curses. Their endurance echoes the promises. Black people are not an appendix to the Bible's story. They are a missing chapter of Israel's own narrative. Throughout Scripture, the presence of Africa is undeniable. Abraham journeyed into Egypt. Moses was raised in Pharaoh's palace. Solomon's kingdom was enriched by the Queen of Sheba, a ruler from Ethiopia. The Ethiopian eunuch was the first recorded African convert in the New Testament, baptized on the road by Philip. The very geography of the Bible is inseparable from Africa and the Middle East. It was only later through European reinterpretation that the story was lifted out of its African soil and replanted in Western imagination. Even Jewish history itself speaks of dispersion. The tribes of Israel scattered across the world, some into Europe, others into Asia, and many into Africa. Entire communities in Nigeria, Ethiopia, and South Africa trace their heritage to ancient Israel. The Beta Israel of Ethiopia preserved Jewish practices for centuries long before contact with European Jewry. The Lemba people of southern Africa maintain oral traditions of priestly descent and even genetic markers consistent with Levite lineage. These are not fairy tales. They are living testaments that the blood of Israel has always flowed through African veins. And then there is the prophetic memory carried in the diaspora. In the Caribbean, in Brazil, and North America, countless black communities hold to the belief that they are the children of Israel. Their songs, their prayers, their cultural memory reflect a deep conviction. The curses of Deuteronomy 28 fell upon them, but so too will the promises of restoration. Imagine the weight of this. If black people across the globe carry Israel's bloodline, then their suffering under slavery was not random, it was prophetic. Their endurance is not meaningless, it is covenantal. And their future is not hopeless, it is tied to the same promises God gave Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Why has this connection been ignored? Why has the possibility of black Israel been ridiculed or dismissed? Because to acknowledge it would dismantle the empire's greatest lie that Europe is the guardian of the biblical story. If Israel's blood flows through black veins, then the entire foundation of white-centered Christianity and Eurocentric theology collapses. Many communities believe their blood carries the ancient lineage of Israel itself. This is not to say that every black person is biologically descended from Jacob. Lineage's complex bloodlines are diverse, but the prophetic resonance cannot be denied. The parallels between Israel's story and the black experience are too precise, too haunting to be accidental. Ships, chains, bondage, deliverance, covenant, restoration. The patterns repeat as if history itself is prophesying, "You are Israel, you are chosen, you are not forgotten." And this changes everything. It changes how we read scripture. It changes how we view history. It changes how black men and women see themselves not as victims of random injustice, but as heirs of ancient promises. The Bible no longer belongs to someone else's story. It becomes their story, written in their blood, reflected in their suffering, and promised in their future. So when Perry's DNA testifies of ancient lineage, and when archaeology testifies of ancient presence, Scripture itself joins the witness. Bloodstone and word align to declare the same truth. Black people are not outsiders to the biblical story. They are central to it. They are the living Israel walking through history with the curses of Deuteronomy still echoing behind them and the promises of restoration still shining ahead of them. And now we must ask, if black blood is Israel's blood, then what of its strength? What of its resilience? What mysteries lie hidden not only in the scriptures but in the very biology of black DNA? That is where the next revelation awaits. Chapter 7. The biological strength of black DNA. If Albert Perry's bloodline testified to the antiquity of black presence, then modern biology testifies to something just as profound, the extraordinary resilience coded within black DNA. For centuries, the narrative of Africa was framed by suffering, slavery, colonization, poverty, disease. But beneath that narrative lies a biological truth too powerful to ignore. The blood of Africa carries strength, complexity, and resilience unmatched anywhere else on Earth. Scientists studying genetics have long recognized that populations of African descent hold the greatest genetic diversity of any people group. Why? Because Africa is the root. Every other population on Earth descends from a smaller pool of migrants who left Africa tens of thousands of years ago, carrying with them only fragments of the genetic richness their ancestors possessed. That means while Europe, Asia, and the Americas carry narrowed, reduced gene pools, Africa retains the deepest reservoir of human variation. What does this mean practically? It means that black DNA encodes unique defenses against disease, immune responses shaped over millennia of survival and biological complexity that science is only beginning to understand. Take, for example, resistance to malaria. Across many African populations, mutations such as the sickle cell trait, though dangerous in their homozygous form, provide protection against one of the deadliest diseases in human history. What looks like weakness to outsiders is actually a coded survival strategy, evidence of a people shaped by endurance. Or consider lactose tolerance. Many European populations develop the ability to digest milk later in life, a trait celebrated as an advance. But African populations develop the same ability independently across multiple regions in ways that reveal an adaptability unmatched in human history. Black DNA does not merely adapt, it innovates, finding new ways to survive in hostile environments. And yet, for all its richness, the study of black DNA has been astonishingly neglected. Western medicine and genetics have overwhelmingly focused on European genomes, mapping, decoding, and tailoring treatments around them. The result: a medical system that serves Europe first and leaves Africa behind. Drugs are tested on European populations, meaning they are less effective, even harmful for black patients. Conditions that disproportionately affect black people, such as sickle cell anemia, receive far less research funding than conditions affecting white populations. The very people whose DNA holds the deepest genetic wisdom are the most ignored in medical science. Why? Because black blood terrifies history. They study everyone's blood except the blood that terrifies history. Think of the irony. The oldest bloodline on Earth is the least studied. The richest genetic diversity is the most neglected. The people who could unlock cures, resistances, and breakthroughs are sidelined. And this neglect is not accidental, it is systemic. It mirrors the same silencing we saw with Perry's DNA, the same burying of archaeological evidence, the same rewriting of scripture. It is a refusal to face the truth that the people once enslaved are not biologically inferior, but biologically profound. Now let us tie this back to prophecy. The Bible speaks often of resilience. Israel endured exile, captivity, dispersion, and yet survived. Their survival itself was testimony that God's covenant could not be broken. In the same way, black people endured slavery, colonization, systemic racism, and yet survived. And not just survived, they thrived, resisted, and rose. Their DNA carries the biological imprint of that same covenantal resilience. Science calls it adaptation. Scripture calls it testimony. Prophets call it endurance. But the meaning is the same. Black DNA remembers suffering, and it encodes survival. Consider how this plays out today. Studies show African-descended populations often have stronger immune responses to viral infections. Certain cancers, while tragically prevalent in some communities due to environmental factors, also reveal unique patterns of resistance and recovery in others. Even the microbiome, the invisible community of bacteria in our bodies, shows greater diversity in African populations linked to dietary traditions rooted in the land. The richness of life at every biological level reflects a heritage of survival and strength. But here's the tragedy: when Western science ignores black DNA, it not only perpetuates injustice, it robs the entire human race of knowledge. Within the blood of Africa may lie cures for diseases that ravage the world. Within the chromosomes of African-descended peoples may lie answers to pandemics, cancers, and chronic conditions. And yet, because of systemic neglect, those answers remain hidden, unresearched, unexplored. This silence is not just a scientific failure, it is a moral one. It repeats the same lie that has haunted history, that black lives are disposable, their contributions irrelevant, their essence unworthy of study. And yet the truth remains: black DNA carries strength that could heal the world. To deny the study of black DNA is to deny humanity the knowledge of its own resilience. Now imagine what happens when this truth is embraced. Imagine research centers dedicated to decoding the full richness of African genomes, unlocking new treatments, new cures, new possibilities. Imagine medicine built not on the narrow base of European data, but on the broad foundation of African diversity. The future of health, longevity, and survival may very well rest in the very blood that the world tried to suppress. This brings us full circle to the prophetic revelation. Perry's DNA was not just a window into the past. It was a key to the future. The same blood that carries memory also carries potential. The same blood that testifies of origins also encodes survival. The same blood that terrified history may one day save it. But this raises a final haunting question. If the world fears black DNA, what else do they fear? If they silence its story in science, just as they silenced it in history and scripture, what power lies waiting to be revealed when the silence is finally broken? Because here's the truth: no empire wants to face the blood that once built pyramids, the blood that once walked with prophets, the blood that crossed oceans in chains, is the same blood that may hold the cure to humanity's deepest wounds. And no amount of suppression can bury that forever. As Perry's DNA cried out from the lab, so does black DNA cry out today, not only to science, but to the world. Study me, honor me, remember me. For within me lies the story of your beginning and the hope of your future. And now we must move deeper still. For beyond bloodlines and biology, beyond archaeology and prophecy, lies the greatest question of all. What does this mean for identity, destiny, and the future of humanity? Chapter 8: Science and Theology in Collision. When Albert Perry's DNA first emerged from the lab results, the scientific world found itself cornered. The neatly drawn diagrams of human ancestry, the evolutionary family tree printed in textbooks, could not explain him. Perry's Y chromosome, more than 338,000 years old, was a branch that refused to connect to the trunk. He was an outlier, an anomaly, a contradiction that the tree of evolution was never prepared to hold. Science, for all its claims of objectivity, thrives on order. It thrives on classification, on categories, on fitting everything into a system. But Perry's blood refused categorization. He did not fit the narrative of Homo sapiens arising 200,000 years ago, spreading across the earth, neatly replacing or absorbing older populations. His lineage stretched back further than Homo sapiens themselves. In short, Perry broke the story. And when stories break, institutions panic. Scientists debated, was this evidence of interbreeding with an archaic human population? Was Perry's lineage a survival of something older, hidden away in isolated communities until now? Or was it simply proof that the family tree of humanity was more tangled, more mysterious than they dared admit? Each explanation carried the same uneasy truth. The model of human origins was insufficient. But while science struggled to contain the anomaly, theology looked at the same evidence and saw something else. Where science saw contradiction, theology saw confirmation. Scripture had declared long before genetics, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him. Male and female created he them. Genesis 1:27. If life begins in the image of God, then it is no surprise that blood itself, life's carrier, is stamped with divine testimony. Here is the contrast. Science said Perry's DNA was unexplainable. Theology said Perry's DNA was inevitable. Of course, black blood carried a deeper memory because it carried the image of God from the very beginning. Of course, it stretched further back than Homo sapiens because the story of humanity is not just evolution, it is creation. Perry becomes a prophetic marker written in DNA, a genetic seal that black blood carries God's memory. Think of what this means. Science tries to write humanity's story as a random sequence, mutations, accidents, survival of the fittest. In that narrative, people are chance, not chosen. But Perry's DNA disrupts this cold determinism. It whispers that life is not random, it is remembered. It is intentional. It carries purpose encoded within the blood. And when that blood belongs to a man descended from the people the world called slaves, theology demands we ask who truly holds the memory of God. This confrontation between science and theology is not new. For centuries they have clashed over origins, meaning, and truth. Galileo's telescope contradicted church dogma. Darwin's theory unsettled biblical literalism. But Perry's blood brings the conflict into a new arena, an arena where both science and theology must look into the same microscope and admit they are seeing more than they can explain. For the scientist, Perry is a problem. For the theologian, Perry is a prophecy. His DNA says to the academic, "Your tree is incomplete." It says to the church, "Your interpretation has been too narrow." And it says to the world, "Black blood is more than history, it is sacred testimony." Let us not miss this. If Perry's lineage predates Homo sapiens, then the black presence is older than the categories that science uses to define humanity. That means black blood does not simply fit inside the story of evolution, it transcends it. It reminds us that humanity's root is not just biology, but divinity, not just mutation, but memory. This is why empires fear the truth. Because if black blood carries God's memory, then the story of humanity cannot be told without it. The image of God is not whitewashed. It is not westernized. It is encoded in the chromosomes of those who have been despised and enslaved. And when that revelation comes to light, the hierarchies of race and religion tremble. Pause here. Imagine the young student in a classroom taught that science and faith must always be at war. Then he hears Perry's story. Science cannot explain him. Theology embraces him. Suddenly the conflict is not sterile, it is alive. It is written in the veins of a black man whose very existence forces both sides to reconsider what they thought they knew. And deeper still, this collision is not about Perry alone. It is about every black man and woman whose DNA carries the same echoes, the same memory. It is about an entire people whose blood tells a story that neither science nor empire wants to hear. Science cannot fit it into their charts. Empire cannot fit it into their hierarchies. And so they bury it, deny it, silence it. But truth encoded in blood is not so easily silenced. Science calls it anomaly. Theology calls it prophecy. But Perry's DNA calls it memory, the memory of God carried in black blood. This collision leaves us with a choice. We can cling to the broken tree of evolution, forcing anomalies into categories they resist. Or we can accept the testimony of both blood and scripture that life itself is sacred, intentional, and older than we have dared believe. And perhaps this is the deeper revelation. Perry is not the contradiction of science. He is the correction. His DNA does not destroy the story of humanity, it restores it. It restores what was erased, what was buried, what was silenced. It declares that the root of humanity is not European discovery but black origin, not accidental mutation but divine creation, not absence but presence. So here we stand between the microscope and the Bible, between the charts of scientists and the testimony of prophets, between the silence of academia and the cry of blood. And the question presses, in which story will you believe, because Perry's DNA has already spoken. And once blood speaks, it cannot be unsaid. Chapter 9. The legacy that cannot be erased. Empires rise and empires fall. Kingdoms draft their chronicles. Rulers carve their monuments. But blood is older than books and stronger than stone. Blood carries memory where ink fades. And this is the truth that terrifies history. No matter how violently they tried to erase the black story, the legacy survived not in the archives of conquerors, but in the veins of the conquered. For centuries, systems of oppression conspired to bury the truth. Slavery stripped names, families, and languages. Colonization rewrote maps, renamed nations, and erased ancient sovereignty. The whip, the chain, and the branding iron were meant not only to enslave bodies, but to erase memory, to convince a people that they were nothing more than labor for someone else's empire. History tried to paint black men and women as remnants, as fragments, as a people without a past. But blood does not forget. History tried to erase you. Blood refused. This is the twist that no oppressor could calculate. You can chain the body, but you cannot chain DNA. You can burn the books, but you cannot burn chromosomes. You can silence prophets, but you cannot silence the cry of blood. And in that blood, the story remained intact. Perry's DNA was not an anomaly, it was a revelation of this very truth. His blood testified across 338,000 years, declaring that no matter what history wrote, the origin was deeper, older, and rooted in black life. Think of what this means. Black people are not the descendants of debris as the narrative of slavery would suggest. They are not the tattered leftovers of history. They are the heirs of kings, prophets, and the first humans formed in the image of God. When the empires wrote that blackness equaled slavery, blood rewrote it. Blackness equals sovereignty. Blackness equals origin. Blackness equals divine memory. This is why so many of the spirituals sung in the fields were about deliverance, kingship, and prophecy. The enslaved instinctively knew what historians denied, that their suffering was not the end of their story, but the echo of Israel's exile. They sang of Moses because they knew they carried the same covenant. They sang of Zion because they knew it was more than a place, it was their destiny. The world told them they were slaves, but their souls told them they were chosen. Blood is the great equalizer, but it is also the great revealer. Perry's DNA revealed a lineage older than Homo sapiens. But in a broader sense, black blood everywhere reveals a resilience unmatched. Across oceans, across generations, across oppression, it held on. It remembered. It preserved the spark of identity, even when names were stripped away. This is why the testimony of black history cannot be reduced to trauma alone. Yes, there was slavery, oppression, colonization, but beyond that there was and is endurance, kingship, innovation, culture, and sacred memory. The attempt to erase was real, but the refusal of blood to forget was stronger. Think of the prophetic irony. Empires spent centuries declaring that black people were less than human, while the oldest lineage of humanity was carried in black veins. Empires erased African kings from textbooks, while blood preserved the memory of thrones, crowns, and priesthoods. Empires mocked black religion, while scripture itself declared that the life is in the blood. The greatest contradiction of history is this: the very people despised as remnants are in fact the root. Black people are not descendants of residue, but descendants of rulers, prophets, and the first humans who walked the earth. And let us not forget, the erasure was strategic. If you remove a people's history, you control their future. If you tell them they come from chains, they will see themselves as broken. But if they realize they come from kings, they will rise with dignity. That is why the truth of Perry's DNA is so explosive. It does not merely challenge a scientific timeline, it challenges the entire edifice of racial hierarchy. What would it mean if every black child were told not that their history began in the belly of a slave ship, but that their history began at the dawn of humanity? What if every young man and woman in the diaspora understood that their blood carries the memory of prophets and kings? What if instead of shame they were given the truth of sovereignty? Such knowledge would be unstoppable. Such dignity would be uncontainable. This is why the legacy cannot be erased. Because legacy is not paper, it is blood. And blood testifies across generations, crying out when history tries to silence it. It cries out in DNA tests, in archaeological discoveries, in scriptural prophecy, in songs of resistance. It cries out in the dignity of those who refuse to bow to the lie of inferiority. The story of black people is not a story of survival alone. It is a story of endurance, with purpose, of resilience, with prophecy, of memory, with meaning. Perry's blood revealed this scientifically. The Bible reveals it spiritually. Archaeology reveals it historically. Together they form a chorus that cannot be silenced. So the question becomes, if legacy cannot be erased, what do we do with it? Will we continue to let empire write false textbooks, or will we embrace what blood itself declares? Will black people continue to live under the shadow of erasure, or will they rise in the truth of their identity? Because the truth is not optional anymore. Perry's DNA, the land's monuments, the Bible's prophecy, all of them agree. Black blood is not the blood of remnants. It is the blood of beginnings, not the blood of leftovers, the blood of origin. Not erased, not forgotten, but remembered from the very first breath of humanity. And if that is true, then every attempt to erase was not just an injustice, it was a rebellion against truth itself. The legacy stands, the memory lives, the blood refuses to be silenced. And now we must face the final unveiling. If black legacy cannot be erased, then its destiny cannot be denied. And that destiny written in blood is about to rise. Chapter 10. The Final Call. Blood does not lie. Bones do not lie. DNA does not lie. Long after empires rewrite textbooks, long after rulers distort history, long after generations forget their names, the testimony of blood and bone remains. It is evidence that cannot be erased, proof that cannot be silenced. The story of Albert Perry was not about one man, it was about what his blood revealed. A lineage older than Homo sapiens, a memory deeper than history itself, a testimony written in chromosomes that no whip, no chain, no colonizer could erase. But Perry's blood is not alone. Every vein, every cell, every strand of DNA in the black body carries echoes of the same truth. You are not here because of chains. You are here because you were there from the beginning. For centuries, black people were told their story began on slave ships. They were told their lives were accidents of history, fragments of empire, remnants of survival. But Perry's DNA shattered that lie. Archaeology buried in the soil of America shattered that lie. The prophecy of Scripture shattered that lie. And now, standing at the intersection of science, history, and theology, the truth is undeniable. Black people are not the footnote of humanity's story. They are its opening line. So what does this mean for us today? What does it mean for the elder watching whose body still carries the scars of struggle, but whose blood carries the memory of kings? What does it mean for the grandmother who prays every night for her children, not realizing that her prayers rise from the same bloodline that once sang psalms by the rivers of Babylon? What does it mean for the young man who looks in the mirror and sees only struggle, not realizing that his very DNA encodes resilience that has survived millennia? It means that identity is not defined by oppression. It is defined by origin. You were not created in chains. You were created in the image of God. You were not born to be forgotten. You were born to carry memory. You were not placed at the margins. You were rooted at the beginning. History tried to erase you. Blood refused. And because blood refused, legacy stands and destiny remains. This is the lesson that transcends generations. For the older audience, perhaps weary from the years of seeing history repeat its cycles of injustice, the message is this: your life has always carried meaning far greater than society acknowledged. You are not a byproduct of empire. You are a bearer of origin. Your bloodline stretches back not hundreds, but hundreds of thousands of years. You are living proof of endurance, of resilience, of divine memory. For the younger audience still searching for identity in a world of confusion, the message is this: you are not beginning from nothing. You are beginning from everything. You are the continuation of a story written in blood before nations existed, before flags were raised, before chains were forged. Every step you take carries the dignity of those who walked before you, and the responsibility to carry that dignity forward. And for all who listen, regardless of color or creed, the truth of Perry's DNA is not a weapon to divide, but a revelation to awaken. It reminds us that humanity's story is richer, deeper, and more intertwined than we have been told. It humbles us to see that the people long despised are in fact those who carried the memory of our beginnings. But here is where reflection deepens. If blood carries memory, then the question is not whether you possess that memory, it is whether you will live in light of it. Blood testifies, but will you respond? DNA remembers, but will you act? The past cannot be changed, but the future is still unwritten. If your blood contains the memory of the beginning, how will you live from this day forward? Will you live as though you are forgotten, or will you live as though you are chosen? Will you walk in the shadow of chains, or will you rise in the dignity of kings? Will you see yourself as accident, or will you embrace yourself as origin? The time for silence is over. The time for distortion is over. The blood has spoken. Scripture, science, and history converge to say the same thing: your existence is not trivial. It is testimony. Every breath is a continuation of a story older than pyramids, older than prophets, older than Homo sapiens itself. And this story carries responsibility to honor the ancestors who endured, to preserve the dignity that was denied, to rise into the destiny that was hidden. Do not think of yourself as remnants, think of yourself as roots. Do not think of yourself as scattered, think of yourself as seeds. Do not think of yourself as victims, think of yourself as witnesses. Witnesses to the truth that history tried to erase, but blood refused to forget. You are not here because of chains. You are here because you were there from the beginning. And so as this journey closes, it really opens. Because knowledge demands action. Revelation demands response. The question is no longer whether Perry's DNA matters, it does. The question is whether you will live as though your own DNA carries the same testimony. So here is the final call, not from me, but from the blood itself. Rise. Remember. Live as though you were present at the beginning, because in a very real way, you were. And I leave you with this question, one that only you can answer. If your blood carries the memory of origin, if your veins hold the testimony of the beginning, if your DNA refuses to forget what history tried to erase, how will you live from this day forward?